Dzień dobry Państwu, witam Państwa Poranek u Hieronima. Poranek bardzo specjalny, bo jak żeby inaczej, skoro nasz dzisiejszy gość także bardzo specjalny. Nie jest specjalnym gościem w Lublinie, bo tu bywał już wielokrotnie, ale po raz pierwszy jest osobiście w naszej bibliotece, bo pośrednio myślę, że niektórzy z Państwa mogli go gościć w swoich domach, chociażby dzięki tej książce. Tak, proszę Państwa, naszym gościem jest dziś Irving Finkel. Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry.
Witamy serdecznie dla tych z Państwa, którzy jeszcze nie mogą złapać oddechu i nie są pewni, czy to właśnie ten Irving Finkel. Tak, proszę Państwa, brytyjski filolog i asyriolog, asystent kuratora na Wydziale Bliskiego Wschodu w British Museum. Specjalizuje się w tekstach zachowanych na glinianych tabliczkach ze starożytnej Mezopotamii, a pod jego pieczą pozostaje blisko 130 000 tabliczek z pismem klinowym. Wiele lat temu Andrzej Molik, pisząc o naszym dzisiejszym gościu, nazwał go czarodziejem z British Museum. Czarodziejem, spotkanie, z którym można porównać chyba tylko do wędrówki wehikułem czasu. I właśnie do takiej wędrówki będziemy chcieli Państwa dzisiaj zaprosić i udowodnić. To znaczy udowodni Państwu to nasz dzisiejszy gość, bo ja miałam okazję i przyjemność już z nim rozmawiać i wiem doskonale, że taka wędrówka jest możliwa niezależnie od czasu i miejsca, w których się znajdujemy. Taka wędrówka jest możliwa chociażby w momencie, kiedy wezmą Państwo do rąk książkę naszego dzisiejszego gościa. Ta strona jeszcze pusta, ale zaraz po naszym programie poprosimy naszego gościa o specjalną dedykację dla Państwa, o życzenia dla każdego, kto będzie chciał odbyć wędrówkę dzięki niezwykłym kartom tej właśnie książki. A póki co zapraszam Państwa w obiecaną podróż. Przewodnikiem, niezwykłym przewodnikiem, specjalnym przewodnikiem będzie dla Państwa Irving Finkel.
Well, for me, a library is probably the most important of human institutions because the preservation of the written word, which doesn't really concern itself necessarily with the present, but is really orientated towards the rescue of knowledge for the long-term future, is really a hallmark of what it means to be a human being, what it means to have imagination and intelligence, and it's the only way in which the product of such brains will last into the future. So it was a long time before writing came, and when writing came, you have the border between prehistory, when there's no writing, and history, when there is writing, and once you can record history, then you have the theoretical position that human beings can, as it were, study what happened in the past, learn from their mistakes, and not repeat the mistakes in the future. This is the basic idea, in my opinion. Unfortunately, it never seems to work because the human race as a species makes the same mistakes over and over and over again and are doing so today. But the thing about a library, a proper library, is this, that it collects and rescues publications and manuscripts and written documents all across the board, so that ideally the librarian is not a person who says we want this book and we don't want that book, or this book is politically unacceptable to us and we would definitely want these ones here. A real library operates with no discrimination from the institution, and its job will be to stockpile, collect and categorize and make available all the production of human beings in this form. So in my opinion, it is the most enlightened kind of work you could really accomplished. And people in the modern world say, oh, well, books have had their day. We all know about books. But of course, we now have the sacred machinery, the computer, and everything can be scanned, everything can be treated in this special, fortuitous device where the actual storage of books and things becomes redundant. But of course, this is a total illusion, because I predict quite comfortably that every single thing stored on a computer will be lost, will disappear, will be attacked, will be perverted, will be ruined. And all the billions and billions of dollars which are spent in the illusion that once things are fixed electronically, they are safe for the future, will be wasted. And the thing is, if you have a library of books, even written in pencil, provided they are kept away from fire and damp, they will last and last and last. As you can readily see in a library distinguished like this, where old, valuable and beautiful books are also part of the holdings, they are designed to last forever. And inasmuch as anything in the world can do that, books are one of them. Another point about the library which is so significant is that whatever is inside it has been produced by a sentient, thoughtful, intellectual person of one kind or another, where the wording is almost invariably the best they can do. Most people, when they have anything published, it's the best they could do. So in other words, what actually is in a library is always of the upper level about what could theoretically be produced in books. It starts off from an exalted point of view. And I think that there's nothing more exciting than to go into a library you've never been before and wander about and open a door and go behind, and especially if you work in a museum like I do, because in the British Museum, once upon a time, we had the British Library. So the two institutions were wedded together, and curators could actually, if they were looking for a book, rather than go to trouble one of the librarians, who are always very busy, of course, like librarians are, you could go through one of the doors into the great stacks that surrounded the central structure and find the book that you wanted. And in doing that, you discover universes of material you've never heard of before. Sometimes they are related to your own discipline, sometimes they're nothing to do with it, sometimes the title strikes you as peculiar. What language is that? What writing system is that? And I think if I were ever going to be locked anywhere as a punishment and never come out, it would be in the bowels, the resources of a major library, because you could be happy there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think when you survey the monstrous behaviour of the world and the fact that the cancerous disease of warfare has never been put in a bottle and tightened and then thrown in the sea, and that is the end of it, it still rages, that libraries are often one of the victims, and buildings can be replaced. It stands to reason. But when you have a long-running library with a bomb through the ceiling or set fire to, and all the stuff is lost like that, this seems to be a tragedy of unbearable nature. And in the history of libraries, I'm afraid all these things are very, very all too common. Now, another point about it is that if I was in charge of all the libraries of the world and had a very big seat and all the authority, I would try and make everybody want to go inside, because with the prejudice against books, with the thing in school that teachers don't want to teach children anything hard or difficult in case they can't cope, and the resources of the encyclopedia of literature, of poetry, are hardly ever touched. People come out of school with their brains supposedly working at top level with hardly any conviction or any interest in the library world and in the book world. They somehow bypass it. So that if you have a high street with a very beautiful building with a commissaire in a uniform and the door open saying, please come in, and there's a fast food shop and a sports shop and God knows what else on the other side of the road, they will invariably stick to the right-hand side of the road and not go in the library. So I think the librarian's job is to stockpile these resources for the long-term future that we can never predict in the safest possible way. But at the same time, it's very important that children and their grandparents and their parents go to the library regularly for all sorts of reasons. And it's not just to borrow a thriller or something of the kind, but when you go in a library and you ask a person a question, a good librarian will come round and say, well, what an interesting question. You want to know about pirates. Say some boy wants to write a story about pirates. Come right in here. And you take them into a room and you take one huge folio off them. These are the kind of maps they use, and this was written by and the kid will be, and they'll never forget it. And if you do this once to one child, whatever it would be about, there will be in their mind a kind of seed deposit where the word library and the word book will have a kind of warm thing instead of a cold thing or a complete disinterest thing. So I think that the library, the function of a library is on a very exalted level with a very long-term view of the human race, but with a desperate need to take everybody with it, because you can never waste time in a library and you can waste time in any other building very easily. It's a difficult idea how one choose one's favourite library. In my department, where we have material and objects from ancient Mesopotamia, archaeological objects, sculptures and vessels and weapons and all manner of material from ancient Iraq, we also happen to have a library. And this isn't just any old library, let me tell you, because it was the royal library of the king of Assyria, who lived in the city of Nineveh in the 7th century BC, and his name was Ashurbanipal. Now, when Ashurbanipal was king, all the writing in the kingdom was done on these tablets of clay in cuneiform script. This is a well-known thing. But here, with regard to libraries, there is something remarkable, because this king was one of those heroic kings who was a good politician, a good soldier, and a scholar all at once, like somebody in medieval Europe. Very unusual, because most kings are violent and have lots and lots of wives and die of apoplexy when they're 62. So this is a different matter. He was a trained intellectual scholar. And this king Ashurbanipal had an idea one day to gather together documents, clay documents, with records on of all kinds, administrative, lexical, medical, literary, everything, poetry, everything, and bring them to his library in Nineveh. And this went on. Messengers went round the kingdom and brought things that were missing, and he had a room full of the best quality scribes in the world. And when a tablet came, which was in funny writing from down south and rather rough looking, so they would be given this horrible tablet, and then they would make a perfect copy in the best calligraphy for the king's library. And when the excavations in the 19th century took place, they found this library. It was all broken to pieces. And in those days, when there were archaeological expeditions, the country that sent the archaeologists were often able to take the stuff back. So in this case, the material came to the British Museum. So we have this royal library, rather broken in pieces, where people who work on this stuff spend all their lives trying to put them all together to get complete documents. So about my favourite library, if I had a time machine, would be to go in that library when it was complete, not run over by enemies and set on fire and everything broken and we find the remains of it, but to go in there, perhaps when the king was sitting in one seat reading a tablet and his right-hand scholar of astronomy was looking up something which they'd seen in the heavens and discussing with the king what this meant. It would have been very exciting to be there with all these documents all around the walls, because we know that they kept them in niches like this kind of shape in the wall. The tablets were put in the niche, rather like records used to be in record shops when they were all kept on end, that kind of thing. So I would like to go in that library, and I would like to meet the librarian personally and have a cup of whatever we had a cup of. It wouldn't be tea, probably wine, which would be fine. And then, as a kind of add on to this, there is the Library of Alexandria, which is a few centuries later, where they collected in the same way scrolls with everything they could find in Greek, all in one place under one librarian called Eratosthenes. And there are 2 points about it from the history of library which are really interesting. One is that the Assyrian had the idea of everything under one roof, which is a very enlightened, sophisticated view for a librarian. And I believe that the Assyrian library was the stimulus for the Greek library in Alexandria, that they knew about it, it was famous. And then sooner or later, some of the learned scholars in Athens thought, hey, you know, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? And I think that's probably what happened. But the thing is, all of their scrolls went up in smoke. And it's not that people were allowed to have cigarettes in the library. They didn't have cigarettes then. It was a good time before the invention of cigarettes. But nevertheless, the whole library was burned completely. And when the Babylonians overran the library in Nineveh, Ashurbanipal's library, and smashed everything, and they set fire to it, that was the best thing they could have done. Because if you have a library made of clay books, then fire is not the enemy at all. On the contrary, it is rather useful to have the clay turned into terracotta. So the irony is complete. So those 2 libraries, if I was allowed to pick 2, and also allowed to go from one to the other by some magical means, that would be my answer. Well, there was a time when an educated person who had some kind of means would have a private library. And if you lived in a big house, there would be a whole room with a private library, and you have every grade of it down. In the modern world, many people I know don't have any books at all in their houses. Or if they do, there's a thing about dyeing your hair or gardening or things like, you know, those sorts of cooking type books, but no actual books at all. So it's very common nowadays for people not to have books. So it's only a certain proportion of individuals who have any kind of private library at all. Now, clergymen often do, because they are supposed to refer to the book and other books as well. And people of that kind, and university teachers, historians, journalists and so forth, have a private library. So the question about organisation, this is a very interesting matter, because some people, if, in my opinion, if there's something wrong with them, they like to put books in order, alphabetical order by author's name. I think that is terribly, terribly off-putting, because it implies that the books are valued for the wrong reason. So I think order is not, in my idea of a private library, there's no order at all. There's no, you have to know where your books are. I have a lot of books in my house, in fact, many more than I really ought to, because we can't really move. And none of them is in any kind of order at all. I mean, I know someone who has all the red books together, all the green books, and that's another way of doing it. So the author's surname is one, the colour or the size, or even the subject matter. But my own view is I prefer my books to be apparently a random distribution, but I always know where they are. So it's an interesting psychological thing, because what you do thereby is you dominate the library and it doesn't dominate you. Because if you are the kind of librarian that has to have everything in alphabetical order, and you're writing something and you take 12 books and put them on the floor, then you've got to make absolutely sure that Watkins goes before Williams. Otherwise, the universe will come to an end because there's a blunder. So, but if you just put it back where there's a space, move things up and do all that, then it shows that the library is subservient to you and you are not subservient to a librarian. I know a librarian personally who runs a rather esoteric library in London, where most of the journals and books are very handsomely bound to 19th century kind of bindings. And when somebody goes in there to do some research and takes out, say, volume 33 of the Journal of Royal Asiatic Society memoirs and puts it on the table, the librarian who's in charge, because they always have to have somebody in charge in a library, will sit there supposedly doing her work, but going like that and looking at the hole in the space in the shelf and looking at the person, like, how much longer are you going to want this book? And but not saying anything, but implying that it looks unsightly when one is missing, like when somebody loses a tooth. And on top of it, it's all very well, but I want that book back where it belongs. And then these kind of librarian, you can tell them for certain, because when it's 4 o'clock or something, or 1 minute to 4, they push back their chair noisily and come over and take the book and put it back swiftly in its right place. And then everybody in the library feels happy. And the conclusion with such a librarian would be this: for security purposes, it would be much better if the back and front of each book was glued to the next one, so that it would be impossible to take a book out, and probably everybody would be happy. But I'll tell you just the opposite thing that can happen in a library, because a friend of mine was once writing a massive work about the history of vegetable dyes in India, and she discovered that in Mumbai there was a library where they had a journal about this subject from 1780 to 1840. You couldn't find it anywhere in the world, and they were large volumes. So she eventually got permission to consult one of these books, and it was brought to her desk. And with tremendous excitement, she lifted the cover in order to find all the details she was looking for, and it was nothing but dust underneath. And had she sneezed, she said, the whole book would have been dispelled. So sometimes very careful looking after books is not careful enough. Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the founder, whose collections had now been installed in such a building and a library runs on for, would come and keep an eye on it regularly. I mean, I'd be very excited to think that what I'd started had grown in such a way, and that the people I'd never seen before, and scholars from across the world and scientists would come and consult the books. And I think wherever I was, I'd come back and just have a look and see, and also it might be rather interesting if the library contains, say, works written by the founder himself. I don't know whether this is the case, but say he had written a few books, he might be rather interested to see if anybody ever looked at those. And if they didn't, he might perhaps nudge somebody who was at one of the shelves, just a little bit like that, until they got in front of the right letter, and then make a noise like, and then the person would, oh, I say, this book must have been written by the founder. Let's have a look at it. One possible example of a library superstition which allies itself to a general superstition is that in a library with tiers of books, you always have ladders. And there are many people in the world who refuse to walk under a ladder for superstitious reasons. And for example, if someone is painting a house, they will go out into the road rather than go under the ladder. I mean, this is widely described as a superstition. Of course, it might simply be the idea that you didn't want to get paint on your hair. I don't know what it is. But in a library, I suppose it's possible that that would be a superstition you could see. But books on the floor as such, I've never heard of. Is it a serious matter here then? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it in cuneiform writing, because that's what I do, and it would be rather silly to write it in English, for example, or one of those alphabetic writing systems. I mean, that would be rather boring. So I think what I might do is write something about may the doors of the library be open to everybody. We could put that in as a kind of wish, and probably in Sumerian or maybe in Babylonian, we'll have to see. But I think that would be good. I mean, we could write underneath in small writing what it actually said, if that would be helpful. But I think that, I like the idea of a librarian arriving 2 minutes late for work and needing coffee, with the keys and there being a queue of people waiting to get in the library. That would, like in a cinema or in a swimming pool or one of the, that would be the ideal thing. Lots of people. And gosh, it's 2 minutes past 9. I want to get in the library. I mean, that would be a rather fine thing, wouldn't it?